On a freezing morning in Mountain City, a neighbor stepped into a silent home to find a professional-style execution. Billy Payne and Billie Jean Hayworth lay dead, their throats cut, bullets in their skulls. But the most haunting detail was found in the mother's cold arms. Her 7-month-old son, alive and soaked in her blood. The trail didn't lead to a professional assassin, but to a nearby bedroom where a woman used a keyboard to manufacture a CIA conspiracy that demanded blood. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot. Thank you. Mountain City, Tennessee is a place where the geography dictates the temperament, rugged, isolated, and shrouded in the heavy, low-hanging mists of the Appalachian foothills. In 2012, this was a community where family names were currencies and everyone knew which porch light stayed on too late. Into this insular world stepped the Potters, a family that didn't just move into a house, they built a fortress. Marvin Curd Potter was a man forged in the strict, unyielding crucible of the United States Marine Corps. He was a veteran who carried himself with a rigid military posture even in retirement, a man who saw the world through the binary lens of threats and allies. His life was defined by the protection of his perimeter, and at the center of that perimeter were his wife, Barbara, and his adult daughter, Janelle. Curd's presence in Mountain City was one of quiet, disciplined intensity. Neighbors often saw him working around the property, his eyes constantly scanning the road, a man who seemed to be perpetually on guard duty. He was a proficient marksman, a collector of firearms who treated his weapons with the same meticulous care he applied to his family's safety. To Curd, a clean rifle was a symbol of readiness. And in his mind, the world outside the Potter residence was becoming increasingly volatile. He didn't just love his daughter, he saw her as a fragile asset that required 24-hour surveillance. Barbara Potter was the architect of the family's internal reality. While Curd guarded the physical walls, Barbara managed the emotional and psychological gates. She was a woman of sharp observations and deep-seated anxieties, a matriarch who thrived on being the primary caregiver. In her view, the move from Pennsylvania to the quiet corners of Tennessee was a tactical retreat, a way to distance Janelle from a world that had, in Barbara's estimation, consistently failed to understand her daughter's special needs. Barbara wasn't just an enabler, she was a curator of Janelle's experiences. She monitored the telephone calls, she vetted the few people allowed across the threshold, and she reinforced the narrative that Janelle was too sick, too vulnerable, and too precious to exist without constant parental intervention. At the heart of this stifling dynamic was Janelle Potter. In 2012, she was 30 years old, but her life bore the hallmarks of a sheltered adolescent. Janelle was a woman trapped in a biological and social stalemate. She had suffered from type 1 diabetes since childhood, a condition that required rigorous monitoring and frequent insulin injections, tasks that Barbara performed with a sense of ritualistic necessity. Janelle also navigated life with significant hearing loss, wearing hearing aids that served as another layer of separation between her and the outside world. These physical limitations were real, but they were also weaponized by the family dynamic to justify Janelle's near-total isolation. She didn't have a job, she didn't drive, and she didn't have a life that existed independently of the house on the hill. The move from Pennsylvania had been intended as a fresh start, a chance to escape the troubles Janelle had supposedly faced in their previous life. Barbara often told people that they had come to Tennessee for the peace and the mountain air, but the reality was more complex. They moved into a modest home that they quickly transformed into a high-security compound. Curd installed motion-activated lights and security cameras, creating a digital perimeter that mirrored the psychological one Barbara maintained. The house sat back from the road, partially obscured by trees, a silent observer of the small-town life it refused to join. Inside, the dynamic was one of intense, claustrophobic loyalty. If Janelle felt a headache, the entire household went into crisis mode. If Janelle mentioned a mean comment she had read online, Curd checked his ammunition. In this environment, Janelle's social development remained stunted. She communicated with a high-pitched, childlike cadence, often deferring to her mother for even the simplest decisions. Her parents viewed her as delicate, a term that encompassed her physical health, but also acted as a catch-all for her inability to cope with social friction. In Mountain City, a town where social currency was built on long-standing family ties and shared history, the Potters were an anomaly, a family that arrived with its own prepackaged set of enemies and a burning need to be the victim in every story. The interior of the Potter home was a study in sterile control. The air often smelled of antiseptic and home-cooked meals, a domestic sanctuary where the ticking of clocks was the loudest sound. Janelle spent the vast majority of her time in her bedroom, a space filled with the remnants of a girlhood that had never quite ended. It was here that she sought the connection she was denied in the physical world. The hum of her desktop computer was the heartbeat of her social existence. On platforms like Facebook, Janelle could bypass her hearing aids and her social anxieties. She could curate a version of herself that was vibrant, sought after, and, most importantly, protected by a digital army. This was the Potter Fortress, a triad of individuals bound together by a toxic mix of devotion and paranoia. They were outsiders by choice, viewing the locals of Mountain City with a suspicion that bordered on the pathological. Every unreturned wave from a neighbor was cataloged as a slight. Every piece of local gossip was interpreted as a conspiracy. Janelle's parents didn't see a 30-year-old woman who needed independence. They saw a child who needed to be shielded from the wolves of the real world. Janelle's life was a series of missed milestones. No prom, no college graduation, no career. Instead, her milestones were measured in friend requests and wall posts. This psychological insulation created a vacuum, and as any student of human nature knows, a vacuum eventually seeks to be filled. For Janelle, that void was filled by the flickering glow of her monitor, where she began to weave a web of friendships and rivalries that would eventually demand a sacrifice in blood. The Potters had spent years preparing for a physical invasion, never realizing that the greatest threat to their family and to the lives of two innocent young parents was already inside the house, typing away in the dark. She was a woman waiting for her life to begin, unaware that the path she was choosing would instead lead to its violent conclusion. The first crack in the Potter Fortress appeared at a local pharmacy, a mundane setting for the beginning of a tragedy. Janelle was there, likely waiting for one of her many prescriptions, when she crossed paths with Jen Thomas. Jen was everything Janelle was not: socially fluid, well-connected in the local scene, and possessed of a natural, effortless charisma. Seeing the quiet, somewhat awkward woman who always seemed to be shadowed by her mother, Jen did something that few in Mountain City had dared to do. She reached out. She offered a smile, a few words of small talk, and eventually, a bridge into her world. For Janelle, this wasn't just a conversation. It was a lifeline. It was the first time in her 30 years that she felt the possibility of a social identity that didn't begin and end with her parents. Jen Thomas, perhaps fueled by a sense of neighborly compassion, began to integrate Janelle into her circle. This was a tight-knit group of friends who spent their weekends at local bars, planning lake trips and navigating the standard interpersonal dramas of a small town. For a brief window of time, Janelle was a part of it. She was invited to gatherings, she was included in the group chats of the era, and she finally had a reason to dress up and leave the house on the hill. But the transition from a sheltered life to a complex social web was fraught with unspoken dangers. Janelle didn't have the calluses of a typical social upbringing. She lacked the ability to distinguish between a playful jab and a genuine insult. Through Jen, Janelle was introduced to the two people who would become the center of her universe: Billy Payne and Billie Jean Hayworth. Billy Payne was Jen's brother, a man described by many as a typical mountain guy, rugged, hardworking, and deeply protective of his family. He was handsome in a way that felt approachable, and Janelle was almost immediately captivated by him. He represented a world of masculinity and freedom that she had only ever observed from a distance. However, Billy wasn't looking for a relationship. He was already deeply in love with Billie Jean Hayworth. Billie Jean was the quintessential cool girl of the town. She was beautiful, vibrant, and possessed a confidence that Janelle found both mesmerizing and deeply threatening. When Billie Jean entered a room, the air seemed to shift toward her. She and Billy were a local power couple, and eventually, they became parents to a young son. In Janelle's mind, Billie Jean wasn't just Billy's girlfriend. She was the gatekeeper to the life Janelle felt she deserved. The envy didn't start as a flame, it was a slow, cold simmer. Janelle began to obsess over Billie Jean's social media, watching the photos of the couple together, the comments from friends praising their relationship, and the general ease with which Billie Jean navigated her life. The friction began in the digital shadows. Janelle started to feel that she was being excluded from certain outings. She would see photos of Jen, Billy, and Billie Jean at the lake or a bonfire, events she hadn't been invited to. In a normal social setting, a person might feel a sting of disappointment and move on, but for Janelle, this was a catastrophe. She began to send messages to Jen, asking why she wasn't included, her tone oscillating between needy and accusatory. Jen, trying to balance her new friend's fragile ego with her long-standing loyalty to her brother and Billie Jean, found herself in an impossible position. The peace of the friendship circle shattered over a Facebook notification. It was the unfriending heard round the county. Billie Jean, weary of the increasingly strange and possessive messages Janelle was sending to Billy and the rest of the group, finally hit the block button. In the architecture of social media, it was a minor act of boundary setting. In the context of Mountain City's social hierarchy, it was a declaration of war. Janelle didn't just see it as a lost connection, she saw it as a public humiliation. She retreated to her bedroom, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her eyes, and began to formulate a narrative of victimization. She told her mother Barbara that the mean girls of the town were targeting her. She claimed that Billie Jean was leading a campaign to harass her, that people were following her in the grocery store, and that hateful comments were being whispered about her behind her back. Barbara, whose entire identity was built on protecting her delicate daughter, didn't question the validity of these claims. She didn't see a 30-year-old woman struggling with social rejection. She saw a pack of wolves circling her cub. Barbara began to monitor Janelle's Facebook feed with the intensity of a forensic analyst, documenting every perceived slight. The tension soon spilled over into the physical world. The Potters claimed that anonymous callers were harassing them in the middle of the night. They reported seeing strange cars idling at the end of their driveway. Janelle told her father, Curd, that she was afraid to leave the house because she feared Billie Payne and Billie Jean were planning to harm her. Curd, the veteran, the protector, felt the old military instincts kick back into high gear. He began to sleep with a weapon near his hand. He stopped trusting the local police, believing they were in league with the bullies who were making his daughter's life a living hell. During this period of escalating paranoia, a new figure entered the domestic drama, Jamie Curd. Jamie was a cousin of sorts, a man who worked with the local police department as a technician and had a long-standing relationship with the Potter family. He was also Janelle's only other consistent link to the outside world. Jamie began to spend more time at the Potter house, fixing their computers and helping Curd with security upgrades. He also became Janelle's confidant. He listened as she wept about Billie Jean's cruelty. He watched as Barbara fueled the fire, telling Janelle that she was too good for this town and that these people would eventually pay for what they had done. But Janelle had another secret, one that she only shared in the deep of the night. She told Jamie and her parents that she had a protector in the high levels of the government. She claimed to be in contact with a man named Chris, a high-ranking CIA operative who had been tasked with watching over her. According to Janelle, Chris had seen the harassment she was enduring and was outraged. He was sending her encrypted emails, telling her that Billie Payne and Billie Jean Hayworth were dangerous criminals who were part of a larger conspiracy. This Chris character became the catalyst for the family's total descent into madness. He wasn't just a friend, he was an authority figure who validated every one of their fears. He provided the intelligence that Curd needed to justify his rage. If Chris said that Billie Payne was a threat to the United States, then Curd, the Marine, had a duty to neutralize that threat. The digital and the physical worlds had now completely merged. The Potters were no longer living in a small town in Tennessee. They were living in a high-stakes spy thriller where the enemies were their neighbors. And the only way to save Janelle was to strike first. The relationship between the Potters and the Payne/Hayworth circle had devolved into a silent, simmering Cold War. Billie Jean and Billie, for their part, mostly ignored the Potters, viewing them as eccentric and overly dramatic outsiders. They had a new baby to care for and a life to build. They had no idea that in a house just a few miles away, a father was cleaning his rifles, a mother was printing out evidence of digital bullying, and a daughter was typing messages to a ghost, messages that were slowly turning into a death warrant. The stage was set for January 31st, 2012, a day when the manufactured reality of the Potters would finally collide with the devastatingly real world of flesh and blood. The morning of January 31st, 2012 did not arrive with the fanfare of tragedy. It was a Tuesday, a day of gray Appalachian indifference. The temperature in Mountain City had plummeted overnight, leaving a thin, crystalline frost clinging to the gravel driveways and the dormant, brown lawns of the town. For Bill Payne Sr., the day began with the familiar, rhythmic pull of routine. He lived just a stone's throw from his son, Billy, and it was his habit to stop by in the early hours to check in, perhaps share a cup of coffee, or simply see if the young family needed anything before the workday truly took hold. As he walked the short distance to his son's house, the air was so cold it felt brittle, snapping with every breath he took. The house sat quiet, nestled into the landscape like a secret. There were no lights on in the windows, no exhaust curling from the tailpipes of the cars in the driveway. It looked exactly as a home should at 6:30 in the morning, peaceful, dormant, and safe. Bill Sr. approached the door, his boots crunching softly on the frozen ground. He didn't knock with urgency. He entered with the ease of a father who was always welcome. But the moment he stepped across the threshold, the silence changed. It was no longer the heavy, restorative quiet of sleep. It was a hollow, airless silence, the kind that rings in the ears and sends a primal warning chill down the spine. The house was warm, the furnace humming somewhere in the basement, but the atmosphere felt refrigerated. He called out his son's name, his voice sounding thin and out of place in the stillness. No answer came. He moved toward the first bedroom. The door was slightly ajar. When he pushed it open, the reality of the digital war Janelle Potter had been waging finally manifested in the physical world. Billie Payne lay in his bed, but he wasn't sleeping. The bed was a landscape of violence. Billie had been shot in the face, a single, devastatingly precise entry wound that spoke of a shooter who didn't hesitate, but the killer hadn't stopped with a bullet. In an act of sheer, visceral hatred, Billy's throat had been cut from ear to ear. The blood had pooled into the mattress, turning the fabric into a dark, heavy weight. Bill Sr. stood in the doorway, the world tilting on its axis, his mind refusing to process that the man in the bed was the same son he had spoken to just hours before. The terror, however, was only halfway finished. Bill Sr. stumbled through the hallway, his breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps, and pushed into the second bedroom. There, he found Billie Jean Hayworth. She was on the floor, slumped against the side of the bed as if she had tried to shield herself in her final moments. Like Billy, she had been executed with a professional's cold efficiency, a gunshot to the head, followed by the same horrific, jagged signature across her throat. And then he heard it, a small, wet sound, a whimper that cut through the absolute stillness of the room. Billie Jean's arms were wrapped tightly around something, or someone. Bill Sr. knelt down, his hands shaking so violently he could barely function, and gently moved her cold, stiffened arms. There, tucked against her chest, soaked in the blood of his mother, was 7-month-old Tyler. The infant was wide-eyed, his face smeared with red, but he was physically unharmed. He had been cradled in the center of an execution, a silent witness to the moment his world was extinguished. The scene was a paradox of brutality and precision. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. The television was still in its place, the wallets untouched. It wasn't a crime of passion in the traditional sense, which is usually messy and chaotic. This had the hallmarks of a tactical extraction. There were no signs of a struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken glass. The killers had moved through the house like shadows, entering and exiting without leaving a trace of their identity. Only the bodies. When the first responders arrived, the air in the small house was thick with the metallic scent of blood and the sterile smell of gunpowder. The police officers, men who had grown up in these mountains and thought they had seen the worst of human nature, found themselves backing out of the rooms to catch their breath. The sheer cold-bloodedness of the act was something Mountain City hadn't seen in generations. The investigators noted that the back door was unlocked. There was no forced entry, suggesting that the victims might have known their killers, or that the killers were confident enough to simply walk in. The forensic team began the grim task of documenting the physics of the crime. They found spent shell casings from a .30 caliber weapon, a choice that struck the lead detectives as unusual for a common criminal but perfectly logical for someone with a military background. The cuts to the throats were deep and deliberate, an overkill measure designed not just to ensure death, but to send a message of absolute dominance. It was a signature of rage, a physical manifestation of a vendetta that had been nurtured in the dark. As the sun began to rise over Mountain City, casting long, pale shadows across the crime scene tape, the news began to ripple outward. The social media war that had been the talk of the town for months had suddenly, inexplicably turned into a double homicide. People looked at their phones, at the Facebook threads where Janelle Potter and Billie Jean Hayworth had traded insults, and felt a new, icy layer of fear. The digital comments, once dismissed as the petty drama of a bored woman, now looked like a series of coordinates leading straight to this blood-soaked hallway. Janelle Potter, meanwhile, remained in her fortress on the hill. While the sirens wailed and the town wept, she sat behind her closed door. The investigation would eventually show that she hadn't pulled the trigger, nor had she held the blade. But as the detectives looked at the professional nature of the hits, they began to wonder how a reclusive woman with no military training could have orchestrated something so tactical. They didn't know yet about the CIA operative named Chris. They didn't know that while Billie Jean was taking her last breath, Janelle was allegedly receiving digital confirmation that the threat had been neutralized. The incident was more than a murder. It was a total collapse of the boundary between a manufactured online fantasy and the irreversible finality of death. 2 young people were gone, a baby was orphaned, and the quiet streets of Mountain City were now haunted by the realization that in the age of the internet, a grudge doesn't need to leave the house to kill. The physical evidence was sparse. A few footprints in the frost, a couple of shell casings, but the digital evidence was a tidal wave waiting just beneath the surface of the Potters' computer screens. The aftermath of the Billy Payne and Billie Jean Hayworth murders was not an explosion of activity, but a suffocating blanket of dread that settled over the Blue Ridge Mountains. In Mountain City, the silence that followed the sirens was heavy, punctuated only by the clicks of locks being turned for the first time in decades. The local police, led by sheriff's deputies who had known the victims since they were children, found themselves in a landscape that no longer made sense. They were looking for a monster in a town where everyone was supposed to be a neighbor. The air in the local diners, once filled with the clatter of silverware and easy gossip, was now thick with a hushed, vibrating tension. People stopped waving at passing cars. They stopped lingering on their porches after sunset. The physical search for the killers began in the frost-covered grass surrounding the Payne residence. K-9 units were brought in, their noses pressed to the frozen earth, seeking a scent that didn't exist. The forensic teams combed the area for footprints, but the ground was so hard and the killers so methodical that the earth yielded nothing but more questions. No DNA was left on the door handles. No discarded cigarette butts or stray fibers. The absence of evidence was, in itself, a chilling piece of data. It suggested a level of planning that went far beyond a neighborhood dispute. It suggested a professional's touch, an execution carried out by someone who understood how to move through a kill zone without leaving a trace. As the sun climbed higher on that first day, the community's shock curdled into a vicious cycle of rumors. In the diners and the gas stations, the name Potter was whispered with a mixture of fear and suspicion. Everyone remembered the Facebook posts. They remembered the drama that had consumed the town's digital feed for the better part of a year. But the idea that a middle-aged veteran and his reclusive daughter could orchestrate a professional execution seemed like a leap too far. Surely, people argued, this was the work of a drug cartel or a professional hitman hired from outside the county. The brutality of the throat-slitting suggested a personal vendetta, but the efficiency of the gunshots suggested a cold, tactical mind. The Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, TBI, was called in, bringing with them a clinical, detached perspective that the local authorities lacked. Special Agent Scott Lott began the arduous task of mapping out the digital void, the space where the real world ended and Janelle Potter's manufactured reality began. While one team looked for physical clues, Lott's team began to scrape the social media profiles of everyone involved. What they found was a toxic archive of human resentment. They spent hours scrolling through thousands of pages of Facebook comments, a digital trail of vitriol that stretched back months. They saw the unfriending that had catalyzed the rage, the blocks, and the increasingly erratic messages sent in the dead of night. They also saw something strange in the Potter family's behavior. While the rest of the town was mourning, the Potters were fortifying. Marvin Curd Potter didn't attend the vigils. He didn't offer condolences. Instead, he sat on his porch with a shotgun across his lap, telling anyone who would listen that he was the one who was truly in danger. He claimed that the friends of the victims were going to come for his family next. He was playing the role of the besieged soldier, even as his neighbors were being buried. He told investigators that he had stepped up his security because the harassment from the Payne and Hayworth families had reached a breaking point, despite the fact that those individuals were currently lying in the morgue. The search for the killers led the TBI to the Potter residence early in the investigation. They expected to find a family in mourning, or perhaps in hiding, but instead they found a household that was strangely energized. Barbara Potter met the agents at the door, her hands clutching a stack of printed Facebook pages. She didn't want to talk about Billy or Billie Jean. She wanted to talk about the bullying her daughter had suffered. She spoke of Janelle as if she were a saint being martyred by the local youth. She claimed that Billie Jean had been the aggressor, that Janelle was terrified for her life, and that the murders were likely the result of Billy's shady lifestyle catching up to him. To the investigators, the disconnect was jarring. 2 people were dead, a baby was covered in blood, and Barbara was worried about a digital slight from 6 months ago. Janelle, for her part, remained a ghost within the house. She stayed in her room, the door closed, communicating primarily through her parents or her computer. When the police finally sat her down for an interview, the narrative of her life became even more apparent. She spoke in a high, thin whisper, deferring every question to her mother. She claimed she didn't even know Billy and Billie Jean were dead until the police arrived, despite the town being awash in the news for hours. She wept not for the victims but for herself, telling the agents that the murders would only make people hate her more. The investigation hit its first major red herring when a witness reported seeing a dark SUV idling near the Payne house on the night of the murders. For 48 hours, the TBI chased the vehicle across state lines, thinking they had found the professional hitmen. They tracked down leads in North Carolina and Virginia, only to find that the vehicle belonged to a harmless traveler who had simply gotten lost in the mountain fog. It was a frustrating, high-stakes dead end that only served to heighten the town's anxiety. If it wasn't professional hitmen from out of state, then the killers were still walking the streets of Mountain City. The search then shifted back to the digital footprint. The TBI began to notice a pattern in the Potters' emails. There were references to a third party, someone who wasn't a family member but who seemed to be directing their actions. This was the first time the name Chris surfaced in the official logs. At first, the agents thought Chris might be a local boyfriend or perhaps a radicalized acquaintance. They searched through Janelle's phone records and email accounts, looking for a physical address or a real-life identity for this mysterious protector. But as they dug deeper, the digital void became even more complex. They found emails from Chris that were filled with military jargon and references to high-level CIA operations. Chris was telling the Potters that Billie Jean Hayworth was a threat to national security. He was telling them that the CIA was monitoring the social media war and that drastic measures were being authorized. He claimed that Billy Payne was a trained killer and that Janelle was the only one standing in the way of a major local conspiracy. To a rational observer, The emails were absurd, the fever dreams of a keyboard warrior. But to Kurd and Barbara Potter, they were gospel. The search for the physical weapon also continued. Divers were sent into the cold mountain streams, and metal detectors were run over the wooded areas near the Potter home. The detectives were looking for a .30 caliber rifle and the knife used in the overkill mutilations. They found nothing. No weapon, no bloody clothes, no physical proof of a conspiracy. The Potters had been meticulous. However, the TBI knew that while you can scrub blood from a floor, it is much harder to scrub data from a hard drive. They seized the computers from the Potter home, a move that Janelle and Barbara protested with theatrical outrage. As the black towers of the family's computers were carried out of the house, Janelle allegedly watched from her window, her face a pale mask in the shadows. She knew that her protector Chris existed only in the wires in the code, and those wires were now in the hands of the state. The town of Mountain City remained paralyzed. The funeral for Billy and Billie Jean was one of the largest in the county's history, a sea of black coats and muffled sobs. The sense of loss was compounded by the sense of betrayal. The digital void had claimed its victims, and now it was up to the forensic analysts to find the path back to the truth. They were no longer just searching for a killer. They were searching for a man who didn't exist. The investigation into the deaths of Billy Payne and Billie Jean Hayworth shifted from the blood-stained carpet of their home to the clinical, flickering glow of computer monitors at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. While the physical evidence remained stubbornly elusive, the digital trail was beginning to scream. Detectives focused their attention on Jamie Kurd, the family friend and computer technician who had a foot in both worlds. He was a local who knew the victims, but he was also the primary support system for the Potters' technological needs. When investigators brought Jamie in for questioning, they didn't find a cold-blooded killer. They found a man who appeared to be under a profound psychological spell. Jamie Kurd initially denied any involvement, but when presented with the forensic data showing his presence near the crime scene and his constant communication with the Potters, the facade began to crumble. He told the investigators a story that seemed pulled from a pulp spy novel. He claimed that the murders were not a personal vendetta, but a sanctioned operation directed by a man named Chris. According to Jamie, Chris was a high-level CIA operative who had been monitoring the social media war in Mountain City. Chris had convinced the group that Billie Jean Hayworth was not just a mean-spirited girl on Facebook, but a genuine threat to national security who was planning to harm Janelle. The detectives listened in disbelief as Jamie described how Chris would send encrypted emails and instant messages, providing tactical advice and urging the family to protect Janelle at all costs. Jamie claimed that he and Marvin Kurd Potter had carried out the hits because they believed they were working on behalf of the government to neutralize a dangerous target. This was the CIA pivot, the moment the case moved from a standard double homicide to a study in extreme psychological manipulation and catfishing. The investigators now had a confession, but they needed to find the man behind the curtain. Who was Chris? The forensic analysts at the TBI performed a deep dive into the Potters' seized computers, tracing the IP addresses of the emails sent by the mysterious operative. In a shocking turn of events, the digital breadcrumbs didn't lead to an office in Langley, Virginia, or a secure server in Washington, D.C. Every single message from Chris had been sent from within the Potter residence. The CIA operative was a ghost manufactured by Janelle Potter herself. Janelle had created dozens of fake email accounts and social media profiles to weave a web of deceit. She didn't just play one character, she played an entire cast. She would send emails as Chris to her father, praising his military service and telling him that his daughter's life was in his hands. Then she would switch accounts and send messages to Jamie Kurd, flirting with him as Janelle, and then as Chris, commanding him to help Kurd save her. She was the architect of her own rescue, creating a world where she was the most important person on the planet, protected by the most powerful agencies in the world. The investigation revealed that Janelle had sent over 3,000 emails under the guise of Chris. She used specific military jargon she had overheard from her father to make the character more believable. She manufactured threats, telling her father that she had seen Billy Payne and Billie Jean Hayworth lurking around their house with weapons. She convinced her parents that the local police were corrupt and that Chris was the only one they could trust. For Marvin Potter, the veteran looking for a mission, and Barbara Potter, the mother looking for a reason to keep her daughter isolated, the lies were the perfect fuel for their pre-existing paranoia. When the TBI agents confronted Janelle with the evidence of her digital masquerade, she retreated into her childlike persona, claiming she didn't know how computers worked or what an IP address was. But the evidence was insurmountable. They found drafts of the Chris emails in her personal folders and logs of her switching between accounts in a matter of seconds. The most damning evidence, however, was found in her mother's records. Barbara Potter hadn't just been a passive observer, she had been a collaborator. Barbara had helped curate the evidence of bullying and had encouraged Kurd to take action based on the intelligence Chris provided. The investigation painted a picture of a family that had collectively seceded from reality. They had lived in a shared delusion for years, a psychological echo chamber where every fear was amplified and every lie was accepted as truth. The digital footprints showed that even on the morning of the murders, Janelle was busy online, ensuring that her father and Jamie stayed focused on the target. She had used her keyboard to turn a man she claimed to love and a father who adored her into executioners. The CIA pivot also exposed the tragic vulnerability of Jamie Kurd. He was a man with a desperate need for belonging, and Janelle had exploited that need with surgical precision. She had made him feel like a hero in a high-stakes thriller, a protector of a woman he cared for. In reality, he was a pawn in a game of digital spite. As the detectives pieced together the timeline, they realized that the murders were the inevitable conclusion of a narrative Janelle had been writing for months. A story where Billie Jean Hayworth had to die so that Janelle could remain the victimized center of her family's universe. By the end of the investigation, the TBI had thousands of pages of digital evidence, a full confession from Jamie Kurd, and the physical testimony of a father who admitted he did what he had to do to save his daughter. The weapons were eventually found. Marvin Potter had hidden them in a secret compartment in his garage. The forensics matched the shell casings found at the scene. The web was finally complete. The CIA operative, Chris, was dead, and in his place stood a woman who had used the internet to commit a murder without ever pulling a trigger. The town of Mountain City watched in horror as the Potters were led away in handcuffs, the final act of a digital tragedy that had left 2 young people dead and an entire community scarred by the power of a manufactured shadow. The legal reckoning for the Potter family was as clinical and unyielding as the murders themselves. In 2013, Marvin Kurd Potter and Jamie Kurd faced the first wave of justice. Jamie, whose confession had dismantled the CIA facade, pleaded guilty to 2 counts of first-degree murder, receiving a sentence of 25 years in exchange for his testimony against the others. Kurd, however, remained defiant, a soldier clinging to a false mission until a jury handed him 2 life sentences. The following year, the Shadow Online truly met the light of the courtroom. In a high-profile trial that captivated Tennessee, Janelle and Barbara Potter were tried together. Prosecutors presented the thousands of Chris emails exposing Janelle as the digital puppet master who had manufactured a war. Despite Janelle's defense portraying her as an innocent with a low IQ, the jury saw the calculated malice in her keystrokes. In May 2015, both women were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The protector had become the prisoner. In the quiet echoes of Mountain City, the legacy of Janelle Potter remains a chilling reminder of the internet's power to distort the soul. Billie Payne and Billie Jean Hayworth were not killed by a government conspiracy, but by a neighbor's pathological need for control. Today, Janelle and Barbara sit in separate cells, their digital world replaced by concrete walls. Their case stands as a permanent warning. Behind every screen, there is a reality that no block or unfriend button can ever truly erase. If you are finished watching, you're a real true crime fan. Subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. See you in the next video.